everybody, and welcome to our afternoon session on lessons in forming successful international higher education partnerships. I'm Phil Silos with RTI. I'm going to be moderating our conversation, which is going to consist of some brief presentations and then an extended panel discussion, hopefully with your extensive and most importantly, right after lunch, awake participation for the next hour and a half. We have four presenters who comprise our panel today who have extensive experience from the U.S. side in higher education partnerships in support of development goals, which are, as all of you know, sort of an increasingly interesting and important component of especially USAID's international development education strategy under Goal 2. Our speakers today in alphabetical order, actually I'll start here. Out of alphabetical order, Rosemary Ortleb-Paget is the Associate Dean for International Programs at Nassau Community College in New York and also Program Officer for Lebanon. To her left is Hazel, now I'm going to mess the pronunciation, Chipotle, who is a Senior Program Specialist for BMENA at Higher Education for Development here in Washington. To her left is Andrew Baird, who is Senior Director for Economic and Workforce Development at the International Development Group at RTI here in Washington. And finally, Dr. Mark Robson from Rutgers. He's the Dean of Agricultural and Urban Programs and a Professor of Entomology in the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, Rutgers University, New Jersey. So we're going to start with, the order is going to be not left to right, but we're going to start with Andrew, to give a little bit of an overview on RTI's higher education partnership model and current programs. Then we're going to move to Hazel to introduce the HED program and the partnership model with a video and presentation. Rosemary is going to follow with an introduction to Nassau and the SUNY College system, as well as her partner institution in Lebanon, and sort of give a little more depth on the HED partnership program and model. And finally, Mark is going to introduce Rutgers and the numerous partnerships in which he is involved. We'll then have a moderated panel discussion for the remainder of the session, and hopefully your engagement will begin. All right, so over to Andrew.
All right, thanks, Phil. Just testing this mic. We can hear all right in the back? All right. Well, I'd love to say that actually what I'm talking about is a model, but that makes it sound far too well thought out than what probably the reality is. So I think really what I'm going to start with in my opening remarks here is just to set the stage a little bit to provide some context and illustration for the types of partnerships that RTI is engaged with in the higher education space. And to do that, I'm just going to talk about a couple of programs, USAID funded projects that we're implementing now in concert with university partners. The first one I'm going to mention is the Liberia EHELD program. EHELD is excellence for higher education, or excellence in higher education for Liberian development. And we look at this project, as we do really several others, as kind of hybrids between higher education and economic development, workforce development programs, which is, I think, why we're bringing it to this particular forum. And by that, the EHELD program in particular is explicit about trying to develop the skills that are the most needed right now for this stage of Liberia's development. And the two areas that this program is focused on is engineering, working with the University of Liberia and creating a center of excellence for engineering, and a private university north of Monrovia called Cuttington University and their agricultural development program. So it's really those two areas that this project is focused on. Our partners from the U.S. university side are Rutgers, and you'll hear more about that partnership, I'm sure. North Carolina State University and their agricultural program, and the University of Michigan and their engineering program. And Rutgers, I should mention, is bridging both those areas. They're providing assistance in both the engineering and the ag part. So just real quickly, some of the components, just again, so we're getting a picture of what we're talking about here, include faculty development, so degree programs for Liberian faculty members, curriculum design, looking at building partnerships between the private sector in Liberia and those university programs so that the industries, the sectors are feeding their requirements into the universities as those curriculums are being designed. Looking at ways that you can engage the private sector in the teaching, whether it's short courses or guest lectures, designing internship programs for students, career services for students. So it's a rather broad area. And then on the other hand, looking from the states, from the perspective of our university partners there, they're bringing faculty in for these degree programs and getting the cultural exchanges out of those and the institutional linkages that they'll develop by having faculty from these universities in Liberia long-term on their campuses, and opportunities for students from the universities as well to engage. The second one I'm going to mention briefly here is actually just beginning, and it's the Philippine STRIDE program. STRIDE is science, technology, research, and innovation for development. I still want the job someday at AID that thinks of all of these acronyms. That program is slightly different in that it's really focused on building Philippine university linkages with industry around research and innovation. So trying to become much more applied research, practical, oriented towards economic development challenges in the country. And this program, again, kind of has really a three-way partnership model built into it. And that model is U.S. universities partnering with Philippine universities in many of the same ways that I described in Liberia, faculty training and exchange, probably more exchange bringing U.S. faculty into the Philippine universities, but again, focused on this research and innovation space. And then, again, the second part of that kind of triangle of partnerships is the partnerships between the Philippine universities and the Philippine industries. So I think that's, the basic dynamic of those programs. As we get into the conversation later, we're going to be talking more about some of the motivations behind why universities would be coming engaged, and then the practical aspects of implementation and sustainability of those. And, I'll stop there real quickly, just introducing those programs as context. We'll be talking around some of those, using them as examples as we go through this. So.
Sure. Let me just. So I decided that rather than try to explain our very complicated program to you by speaking directly to you about it, that I wanted to show you this video that I think does a much more concise and more efficient job than I could. So here we go.
Higher education contributes to creating new bodies of knowledge, engaging active and emergent leadership, building competent workforces, and bringing solutions to market. For over 20 years, Higher Education for Development, HED, has partnered with the U.S. government and tertiary institutions to expand the engagement of higher education in addressing development challenges. HED focuses on development of human capital and institutional strengthening, which are necessary for economic growth and social advancement. HED does this by supporting partnerships between institutions of higher education. HED ensures competent project management by fostering a culture of evidence-based decision-making and reflective learning among partners. Extensive access to the higher education community allows HED to mobilize cross-sectoral expertise and other resources in support of partnerships, expanding the impact of investments beyond the institutions directly involved. HED provides expertise to higher education partners and donors throughout the partnership lifecycle, which is made up of 5 distinct, mutually reinforcing phases. Prior to project startup, and with its donor strategic interests in mind, HED carefully studies country contexts and assesses specific local and higher education institutional needs. HED draws from its network of contacts within the higher education community, as well as its own expert staff, to assemble an assessment and project design team with relevant regional, sectoral, and programmatic experience. Using HED's comprehensive assessment tools, this team collects information to develop a project design, which includes a theory of change and a results-based management framework. A request for application is released and proposals are solicited to bring the best of academia's know-how to deliver the project. In response, interested higher education institutions propose implementation strategies for achieving the results identified in the design, and also a monitoring and evaluation plan to measure those achievements. HED then convenes a peer review panel to serve as the basis for a fair, transparent, and merit-based competition through which the institutional partners are selected. After institutional partners have been selected and an award agreement has been finalized, HED facilitates the startup. A key objective of this phase is to establish a collaborative relationship among all partners. During this 90-day period, partners collect baseline data, which is used to validate the proposed implementation strategy and to finalize the results-based management framework. Partners also develop and agree on management plans. The project startup enables the implementing partners to ground their strategies in the reality of the local context and donor requirements, while establishing a productive working relationship. HED supports the partners as they implement the project. Collecting and analyzing performance data throughout the course of the project is the centerpiece of HED's results-based project management approach. The results framework guides implementing partners to provide data on the achievement of results. HED facilitates the process of using this data for evidence-based implementation decision-making. In addition to this technical assistance to implementing partners, HED is able to disaggregate, analyze, and report results on a portfolio of projects funded by a donor across multiple categories, which could include sectors, geographic areas, entire portfolios or individual projects, at institutional and individual beneficiary levels. As projects are completed, HED leads an outcome and impact evaluation. The evaluation design answers research questions about the core educational offerings that have been developed, institutional strengthening, and also the alliances formed between the institutions of higher education and key partners. In this way, HED is able to assess the overall contribution to new bodies of knowledge, competent workforce, and leadership development. Comprehensive collaboration of HED and its partners throughout the project lifecycle ensures the successful management of these partnerships.
So I promise I won't subject you to that voice again, but I hope that helped to give you a general sense of who we are, who HED is, what we do, who we work with. We, as you can imagine from that overview, are a very diverse program. We work globally all around the world in a number of different sectors. Right now we manage 41 partnerships that include 93 different higher education institutions around the world, including in the US. And I have some copies of our annual report up here. If anyone is interested in taking them, please do. That'll give you some more detailed information. So I'm a senior program specialist for our BIMENA program, our broader Middle East and North Africa program. At present, I work primarily with our broader Middle East and North Africa community college initiative, which brings together, it's a group of 10 partnerships across 6 different countries in the Bamina region. And it brings the experience and expertise of U.S. community colleges together with counterparts that are 2-year or technical colleges in the region in order to focus on really promoting workforce development, enhancing technical and vocational training opportunities. And 6 of these partnerships have a particular focus on entrepreneurship development. This is our framework from our goals, objectives, and outcomes of that initiative. My colleague Rosemary represents a partnership director from the partnership that's working in Lebanon, and she'll be talking to you more about that. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Hazel. As Hazel said, I work at Nassau Community College on Long Island. We currently work in Lebanon with the Bamina project. Nassau Community College is one of the largest community colleges in the United States. We have 23,000 students. Nassau is part of the State University of New York, which is the largest public education system in the United States. We have 64 campuses, and half of them are community colleges. We have about 600,000 students in New York State, so it's pretty large. However, community colleges sort of struggle sometimes to find their way in international programs, which is why we're so fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with HED. So that's Nassau, but I think more relevant to this conversation is our partner school. It's a foundation, an NGO in Lebanon called Al-Kafat Foundation. Just to give you a very brief overview of Al-Kafat, it was founded in 1957, primarily to serve the underserved populations in Lebanon, socially and economically disadvantaged students that also had disabilities. Now, Al-Kafat has grown to 7 different centers in Lebanon. They serve over 5,000 students and clients every day. They have several specialty centers for multiple handicaps, for autism, but they also house a university, Al-Kafat University, an Al-Kafat Technical School, as well as a hospitality and restaurant school. So Al-Kafat has a very interesting education model, and this is sort of why they sort of fit together with Nassau and community colleges pretty well. They are in fact a system of schools, as I described, but Al-Kafat has an embedded workforce training program at their university and technical school. So students will work during the day at one of the centers, one of the facilities, and then they will go to school, and they will earn a wage, and they will also actually contribute to the foundation so that the foundation can continue bringing in students who are, all the students at Al-Kafat University and centers are highly subsidized. Most of the education provided is free. And just to give you a very quick example of one of the programs, Al-Kafat has a school of education that trains teachers to work in special education fields. So these teachers work at the schools, the centers during the day, getting valuable experience. They earn a wage, and then they go to school at night. So this is the model that Al-Kafat employs across many, many different academic and technical specialty areas. Our partnership started about 3 years ago, much through the process that the video described. Initially, we applied for a seed grant, a planning grant through HED for about $60,000. That was, I think, 6 or 9 months in duration. And it allowed us to conduct a baseline assessment and sort of plan what our partnership would be later on down the road. So now it's 3 years later, and we focus on curriculum development, a lot of similar things that you were talking about with the partnership that you described. But curriculum development, one of our areas of focus, because we are a community college, is student support services. So we worked on a learning center, we worked on an English as a second language program. We worked with career services and educational planning services, but also with business curriculum, because it is an entrepreneurship grant. So we've had a lot of success, and I'm looking forward to sharing more of what we've learned with you.
Well, I'm grateful to Phil and Andrew for inviting me to be part of the panel. I'm from Rutgers. It's in the central part of New Jersey. We're one of the oldest and largest educational institutions in the U.S., founded before the country was founded back in 1766. What makes us unique is that we are one of the original colonial colleges and the only one that has become a public institution. The others are all Ivy League institutions that are private, so we have the distinction of being the one that went public. Rutgers has about a 60,000 student population, about 40,000 undergraduates, 20,000 graduate students. And what we think brings a unique flavor to our international collaborations with RTI and other folks is the fact that we are a land-grant institution. That is, that through the Morrill Act in 1864, we have the charge, the responsibility as the land-grant institution for New Jersey to provide training and technical support to the general population and historically to folks in agriculture. And that has served us well as we start to do these projects like the eHealth project and part of the STRIDE project. It does pose some problems, of course, as a public institution. When you do international programs, they have to be fully extramurally funded. And that's brought to my attention as the Dean of Ag Programs recently, when I thought I was doing something clever by making a presentation on farming in Southeast Asia during a farmer meeting at the lunchtime. As a dean, you spend your career welcoming people and sending them away. And so they said, why don't you talk about your work with the farmers in rice farming in Thailand? So I put together what I thought was a thoughtful PowerPoint, only to have the farmers come up and complain later that why was I traveling to other parts of the world and not serving their needs in New Jersey. So even the best ideas sometimes backfire. But we have a large international student population. Rutgers is a bit late coming into the game to globalize the curriculum. Some of you from other places have been way ahead of us, but we're trying to catch up now. We probably have programs or agreements with about 150 institutions around the world. We have students that represent over 100 countries. One of the things that's exciting for us, it's sort of helped us revisit the relevance of our curriculum, is to come up with these new professional science masters. And in the program that Andrew mentioned, STRIDE, we have built in an opportunity to bring young men and women from the Philippines to get these PSMs. Now, when you talked about acronyms, the original acronym that went out for this one was PMS, and then someone thought hard about that and realized that it wasn't a good name, so we changed it to Professional Science Masters. And what the student receives is an MBS. How many letters can you put in the sentence? And it's a Master's of Business and Science. Half the master's degree focuses on the technical area, and the other half focuses on business and economic development, things that are relevant for people coming from a developing country. So we're excited about this opportunity. We think that it's an important chance for us to be an active player, and later on we'll talk about how we do that with our other partners.
Great. I have to give this panel an award for being entirely under time. So given that they've been extremely succinct, I'll fill up a little time by asking you if there are any clarifying questions you'd like to ask before we move on into a more thorough sort of thematic discussion related to partnership formation, implementation, and sustainability. Are there any questions from the audience at this point? Now, there are, of course, as always, index cards on the table. If there are specific questions, please write them down and hold them up, and someone will come and bring the questions up here. And we certainly want to make this a discussion more than just presentations. So I'll encourage you to just raise your hand if you want to start participating in the conversation, beginning about now. So the first of the three themes we really want to dig into is the question of how partnerships are formed, and particularly looking at some of the incentives for partnership formation on the side of the U.S. institutions, many of whom you as implementers may be approaching to try to engage at some point in programs that you're implementing. And I'm going to ask Rosemary to start, simply because to me it seems like the community college with a local mission is the one where the chasm between core mission and international programs may be the largest, and maybe I can be corrected on that. But do you want to sort of bring the topic in for us?
Sure. Thank you. It certainly is difficult sometimes to make the argument that we should be investing our resources in international programming when there is a lot of need in the community. We're funded, a third of our funding comes from our local tax dollars. So sometimes we do have a little bit of a pushback. However, I think that we're fortunate in that we do have a lot of support from our administration. I think that one of the things that is so obvious, certainly to me and the people that support the programming, is the commonality between workforce training, certainly, but capacity building programming with regard to community colleges. So as a community college, this is part of our mission. We're all about capacity building in our own communities. The project that we're involved in Lebanon is about looking at the needs of the community and the students and finding a way to meet those needs through higher education. So it's kind of a no-brainer on that level. This is what we do, this is what we believe in, this is what we're passionate about. So once I think you sort of draw those parallels and make it clear, it's easier for people to sort of put their head around. They say, okay, I could understand why you would want to do this, but what's in it for us, essentially? And that's a lot of, particularly with capacity building programs, a lot of schools are very interested in international recruitment and bringing international students onto their campuses, and this is not that. This is something very, very different. So if not bringing students to our campuses, what do we get out of this? And I have to say, I coming from a system, and in general, I think that people have paid a lot of lip service to the concept of internationalizing campuses. And I always think to myself, well, what does that mean? Are you going to expand your foreign language program? Or, what is it? What is internationalization? And what is meaningful internationalization? So this project involves faculty, in developing curriculum, in working with our partners on pedagogy and so many different features and things that will directly impact what happens in the classroom in Lebanon. But the takeaway from that is our faculty, who generally would not have the opportunity to have this experience, engage with faculty from abroad. They have this experience that translates to the classroom. So it really does completely open their eyes to a whole new concept of education. And it's the multiplier effect, essentially. So our faculty have these experiences, and this gets passed on really directly to our student body, which is truly internationalization. Our students, become more interested in studying abroad, in, really looking at internationalization and the positive effects that can have, on them, and we see that in a broader sense at the college administration level. So I think that that's been very, very useful in pointing out to the naysayers.
Great. I think that's a great start. So the internationalization of the faculty is really a capacity development exercise in some ways that gets transferred to all of your students. Now, Mark, I want to turn to you because I think we've discussed a little bit that the incentives for faculty members specifically are a bit different in universities, especially for young faculty members. How do you see the partnership formation process in the context of a four-year university, also with a local mission orientation like Rutgers?
So we share all the values and the incentives and motivation that Rosemary mentioned from her school, but at a AAU four-year research institution, we also realize that a lot of these partnerships are high risk. And as a dean and as a senior faculty member, I often remind my junior faculty members that this is something they may want to hold off on unless there's an exceptional opportunity that clearly is going to have big dividends, because our metrics, of course, are papers and research grants, and those are the kinds of outputs that keep our faculty there. Otherwise, they don't get through that enormous hurdle of tenure and promotion. So it's a little bit of a slippery slope. So mix into that the fact that it's a public institution where the dollars that come from the state have to be directed towards the institution. It has to require extramural funding. Now, back to the incentive. The incentive, of course, is that the metrics that all universities use are extramural funds that are brought in, number of scholars trained from other places, international scholars. So it works both ways, and clearly I wouldn't be here if I didn't think it was a valuable use of my time and a valuable use of my faculty's time. So in the end, if you do the analysis, you'll realize it's a very positive thing. It's important because we see it as a chance to bring students. You always recruit, you're never not recruiting. You're all recruiting today to look for folks to partner with, and so am I. There's an opportunity for us to bring international students and faculty to our campus to improve the richness and diversity that we have. It's an opportunity through these partnerships to send our students out. We have probably one of the worst number of students that go abroad of any big major land-grant institution. We're desperately trying to improve that, but our peer institutions exceed us. I think the closest one to us is more than twice the number of kids that go out than we have, so we're working hard to fix that. So that's the motivation. And finally, it's a research institution. It's a chance to do collaborative research in other settings, and it really gives us a larger platform or framework. Now, the challenge, of course, is that you want faculty development. You want people to be engaged. You have to sort of buy friends to get this to start. But you can't have academic tourists. I have lots of folks. I have an NIH ITRIO, International Training and Research in Environmental Occupational Health project that I'm the PI on in Southeast Asia. And you would be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised, at the number of people that would love to come to Thailand on my expense for about a week. And I said, no, we do not have a program in academic tourism. You will come for more than a week. You will commit to mentor graduate students and undergraduates, and you'll do something. So I think one of the challenges is, while you work hard to incentivize your colleagues and to get buy-in, you also have to be very clear about the ground rules. And lots of the places that all of us work in are wonderful places with outstanding folks, but it's not the Ritz. And people have to remember that. So I think you have to be realistic. I think every large institution, every higher education institution has an obligation to be a global citizen. It's part of our mission. It's the core of our education. And so while that might be a little bit Pollyanna, I think it's very important to remember that. And I think those of you that are also at academic institutions have that same commitment. It's part of what we do. And it really is an important part of the mission. But it's tough. You have to be realistic. It costs a lot of money. And it's gotten a lot more expensive in the last few years. In the 5 years that I've had the grant in Southeast Asia, airfares have doubled. The baht has gone from 40 baht to the dollar to 29. So my grant has magically cut by 25% just because of exchange rates, and sequestration has helped that even further, and Delta Airlines has doubled the price of the fare. So when you put that all together, you realize that lots of things you do globally are expensive, and some of those things you can't plan for. But in the end, the incentive is high, the risk is not small, but the dividend is enormous, and that's why all big universities try to be part of this, but with usually a larger partner.
Great, and that segues us nicely to Andrew to talk a bit about project initiation from the RTI perspective, partnerships and design.
Right. So I'm glad we started with the representatives from the community college and the four-year institution, because I think it's always a little presumptuous for me to be talking about what their incentives are, but understanding what those incentives are really key to being able to develop partnerships that are attractive. And I'll just add to the list in a couple of areas. From our perspective, when looking for partners, we typically try to find institutions that have demonstrated a commitment to the particular area that we might be working in. So, workforce development, agriculture, workforce development, engineering, research in these institutions. And even more specifically, if possible, have some background and expertise in the country or the region that we'll be working in. And that sounds fairly straightforward. The challenge is finding the right individuals. And I think my experience has been that finding the right champion within the institution is key. That particularly in four-year institutions, interests, and you can certainly correct me here if I got this wrong, but interests are very driven by personal research interests, and their commitment to the project is really typically only as strong as that relationship is between the research that they're engaged in. So finding that match is really important, and then I think having that person navigate their way around what needs to happen in the four-year institution. Just a quick example, we brought Florida State University into our partnership for the STRIDE program, and in order for them to sign on as a partner, they needed departmental sign-off from 27 different deans, even if it had nothing to do with their school. So you need somebody who's going to run that gauntlet for you. Opportunities to involve students. So I'm glad you brought that up. I found that one, surprisingly to me, to be a really strong motivator. University of Michigan in Liberia has really taken full advantage of that in providing opportunities for their undergraduates to run programs. They're running programs in the summer months for rising seniors in high school and rising first-year students at the universities in STEM. And so they're setting up these kind of summer camps, and it's staffed by the University of Michigan students. So providing those types of opportunities, I think, has been a strong motivator. For community colleges, some of those motivators are good, but I have found that really talking about the business case for it is essential, and not in small part because their mandate really is on paper local, even though you can make the argument that this global engagement will do it. Just to paraphrase a friend of mine who works at a community college in North Carolina that kind of illustrates the challenge here. She told me that the fastest way you get hired at a community college is by promising this kind of global engagement and bringing these programs in, and the fastest way you get fired is by actually doing it. So there are certainly some obstacles. But another way to kind of talk about this and frame it is looking at opportunities for applied research. And very practical. And one example that actually isn't ours, but really brought this home to me, was on a recent trip to Jordan. Peter was at Red Rock Community College, had a program in solar energy and solar panels that they were doing with a community college in northern Jordan. And so right out there in the midst of practically nowhere in Jordan is this big sign for Red Rock Community College and solar panels on the roofs of their buildings, and they're doing testing of different types of panels up there and students. Is this one of your programs?
Yeah,
right.
it is,
So this is a great example, I thought, of how that's really practical, and you could just see the benefit on both sides. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to direct two then issues to Hazel. The first is, your process is a bit more formal, as you've shown us, so maybe you could talk a little bit about, it has more to do with applications. And then since you seem to be the Middle East center and aggregator here, we have a question from the audience in terms of question about what impact the new trend toward U.S. universities and other institutions setting up shop in the Middle East has had. How has this impacted the formation of partnerships? And do you have any comparisons?
In terms of the Gulf country approach?
It appears that's,
Yeah.
is that the essence of your question? And starting and about how you launch. So let's give you a chance to address both of
Yeah, I
those.
think that those two issues are actually really closely tied together. As you could imagine from the video that I showed you, HED really puts heavy emphasis on genuine partnership. And so through both our peer review process, where our peer reviewers are subject matter experts, they're maybe country experts, they're higher education experts, they're really looking to see strong and wide-reaching commitment on the U.S. institutional end. They're also really looking to see what the capacity at the U.S. institution is. And so one major issue that is kind of on the opposite end of the incentives for U.S. institutions to get involved are the needs of U.S. institutions. In this particular initiative that Rosemary is representing and that I work with, the Community College Initiative, we found very early on in the design phase of this initiative that community colleges really were but they were a very logical match for addressing workforce development needs across the Middle East and North Africa. It's not a model that is easily replicated or maybe even desirably replicated exactly as is in the Middle East and North Africa, but it is a model that has a lot of really good applications, things that can be easily taken and drawn from and adapted and implemented, such as the very successful case of the Red Rocks Community College Partnership in Jordan that Andrew mentioned, which is one of the 10 partnerships in this initiative. So seeing that and seeing really the benefit that community and technical colleges in the U.S. can bring to the table, we also saw that community colleges, the barriers are pretty high to entry for community colleges. They're not four-year research institutions. They don't necessarily have offices of sponsored programs. It's difficult for community college administrators to make the case to their president or chancellor to get involved in this kind of stuff. And they don't necessarily have the tools to apply and receive funding. So we kind of adapted our model in order to make some space for some capacity development to address those issues within our U.S. community college base of interested applicants. And so through doing that, we were able to take the original proposals, the initial ideas, and help provide some input on budget, budget creation, budget analysis, on implementation strategies, and really very significantly on monitoring and evaluation, on choosing the right indicators, on figuring out how to track those indicators, talking about source documents, and then really using a results-based management approach to bring everything back to the, okay, is this working? Constantly asking that question. If not, why not? Let's change it. If so, why is it working? Let's keep doing it. So I think that that has been one very promising approach that we've had. To the question about the sort of Gulf model of U.S. universities and colleges setting up shop in the Middle East, we don't work as much with that. The countries that we work in with this initiative are Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, Morocco, Lebanon, Yemen, and Bahrain. And our emphasis is really on the true partnership, on bringing both sides to the table, on focusing on that startup phase, focusing on the baseline data collection so that we're sure that everyone around the table has a very clear and complete understanding of who the host country institution is, and not necessarily trying to make that institution more like the US institution, but on seeing what their needs are and being able to address them collaboratively.
Great. Great. I think that actually provides us a nice segue in terms of the indicator choice and the results-based setting up results-based implementation. We have a couple questions that actually fit really nicely later, so thank you for submitting those. I will pull those in. Are there any other questions or areas of discussion that the audience would like to raise? Please go ahead, and I'll just repeat your question just because we're short on mics. So.
I think a role for the universities and the community colleges, higher education, would be to educate the Americans as to why we're doing this. Because a lot of Americans will ask the question, why are you spending money in Lebanon and why are you not helping workers here? And we're a company that does both domestic and international, so I feel good that we help both. But what they don't know is that we're way beyond that. The world is globalized, and the workers that you train in another country may be the workers in America tomorrow, or they may be on a project led by an American company. And so I'd like to see more effort on kind of getting that message out to Americans, that when we go around the world training, it's not we're training Lebanese for Lebanon, we're training Lebanese to be world workers very shortly, and we're actually there now. But it just, there never seems to be a discussion around that. And I think universities could lead that if they really wanted to.
Okay, thanks. Just to make sure the question is recorded, the comment was that there's a potentially role for universities and community colleges in should be sort of working harder to educate their critics about the importance of training world workers, those who are going to be of benefit to the world economy and to American companies in particular in the future. So that's another angle. We'll take comments on that in just a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for both the community college and the four-year university in terms of incentives for universities to become involved with work like this. Have you found ways to make it something that's marketable, like to be able to put in a marketing piece, we do this international work to both attract grants as well as students, and if so, I'd like to hear about that.
So do the colleges and universities find marketing advantage in being able to publicize this kind of work that they do abroad? Let's see if there's one more, and then we'll have the panel address. No? All right, I think the other two questions are a bit better for later. So go ahead and take a shot. Mark, do you want to start with that?
No, you can go first.
We'll do the second question first. Typical university person, go backwards. Yeah, we have, I mean, to be very candid, we've exploited that, in fact. No, that's absolutely right. And I think that's okay. One of the reasons we have is because I think it does make the university more attractive. To sort of blend it to the other question, I think the students, you're not going to change their parents' minds, but you'll change the student's mind. If you've never met a person from someplace else, in college, hopefully you'll meet them and appreciate the culture they bring in, and there'll be some transfer back and forth. With that, though, comes the opportunity to be competitive, to apply for grants, either NIH or NSF or USAID or whatever. You have to have a track record, and the track record, they want to see that you demonstrate that you know what you're doing, that you not only have the technical expertise, most of us have the right engineer or the right biotechnologist, but does he or she have any clue what to do when they go to a developing country where not only do you not have the latest laboratory equipment, you don't have a laboratory. And so I think it's really important to do that and to make sure that you have faculty from other places so that you also have an appreciation for what is going on in the country, that you aren't so arrogant and obnoxious as an American to go in and think that you know what you can do when you get to the other country, that you're respectful and have an appreciation for what you can do collaboratively. So the shorter answer is yes, universities exploit that all the time. We all look to increase the number of international students in our student body for diversity reasons, for the opportunity to just use that as a marketing tool to say that you're going to have that experience. Rosemary.
Yeah, I think we have certainly been able to benefit from publicizing our successes with the project. Certainly at the college level and within the community, local press is always wonderful. But we've also been fortunate to get a lot of support from SUNY System Administration. So the oversight of, the state university system has been really supportive of our project, and we provide them with a lot of information a lot of the time. We've also been very fortunate. HED has always given us an opportunity to showcase our project, which of course we pass on to our administrators and the system administration as well. And we, I think out of that came another opportunity. We were recently an article that involved all of the Bamina partnerships, in fact, was published in NAFSA's International Educator magazine. So I think that it's very, very important to get the word out, and it absolutely does help you in the long run. It's very, very important. I wanted to also, may I address the other comment? I am totally on board with you. I think from the very beginning of our partnership, I would say it was probably, it became very, very clear the first time I went to Lebanon that we were in fact learning it as much, if not more, than what we were providing. And it has impacted the way we think about education. Al-Kafat Foundation, while it's a large foundation in Lebanon, it is, family funded. The State University of New York has a $17 billion budget. And what Al-Kafat can do with their funding is incredible. It's amazing what they can do, and how they take every dollar and they invest it into students, and how it's literally, we call it, it's the circle of life. It really is. How they invest in a student and then the student reinvests into the foundation, which makes it possible to allow more students to come in and benefit from those services. And when we went in and saw this model, it was really, really extraordinary. It was a very, very cathartic experience, I think, for everyone. And we were fortunate that we had faculty members on that first visit. We had administrators, and it absolutely sort of made us think about the fact that we were getting so much out of this partnership. And I think that it impacted everybody on a very personal level, and it certainly changed the way I look at education in general. Yeah.
Well, before we do need to move into the implementation discussions, because initiating the partnerships and getting them launched, incentives, I think had a good, clear discussion. We don't have infinite time, unfortunately. I want to move to Andrew directly and ask you, Andrew, I mean, most of the people in the audience here are implementers, and you've got, I think, good insight on both the startup process and the implementation process, at least in Liberia. What are your key points or key sort of lessons learned from implementing the range of international higher education partnerships? And let's go Andrew, and then Mark, and then back down this way with brief answers, and see if we have questions on that.
Okay, great. Well, I'll start real quickly where Hazel actually had mentioned kind of a clear guidance and clear work planning, clear understanding of roles, I think, is really the beginning there. Not unlike any partnership, I don't think this is different for a university. I think it becomes a little bit more complex with a university because there's a lot more moving parts in many ways, and you're dealing with a lot of different components of the institution, which may only be in and out of kind of the orbit of the project very briefly, and maybe very sporadically. So figuring out effective and efficient ways of keeping everyone who's involved in the project, no matter what their role, up to speed in what's going on. We were talking just briefly kind of before the session about the practicalities of doing that, where you have the on-the-ground project team, and organically the mission begins to shift a little bit in the field, and the university partners that are based wherever they are kind of miss that organic change and are become quite surprised when 2 or 4 months later it seems like their mission might have changed. So figuring out how to keep that. During proposal process, there is a phenomena of selected hearing sometimes, I think, and we're probably all guilty of that to a degree. But I find, in my experience in working with the universities, it may be even greater. And part of it's just because we're coming at it for different directions. And so making sure that once the program is being implemented, that all of those expectations are really clearly stated, and that everyone is hearing. Administration. Institutions like the development institutions, we all complain bitterly about our administrations normally. Just be thankful you're not dealing with university administrations. And they tend to need some help in this particular world. I mean, it's a different world that they're usually not operating in. That's not true for all universities, but for many. So just count on having a fairly high degree of support available when working with them. And then chain of command is another one. And that can be fairly complex. People are answering to different people at the university, and how does the chief of party or the team leader fit into that, and who should they be going to, and what's their relationship with the client. All of those become fairly complex when you're a professor sitting waiting to go over to engage in the project. So that's another one. And then the last one that I'll bring out here in terms of implementation is, all of that said, hopefully you can get through that and you create an environment that's really conducive to pulling out the creativity and the resources that these institutions of higher education have to offer, because they are incredibly rich resources, very diverse, and if you can kind of get through that initial setting up the relationships, it's phenomenal what the institutions can bring to the table in ways that you never would have envisioned originally. So kind of creating that environment, I think, is something that really sets the implementation tone. I hope I wasn't too harsh.
I'm starting to tear up. So, as Andrew appropriately says, universities are not nimble, and those of you that work with universities or are at universities, you know that. And part of it is just the way that we're set up to operate because of our mission and what we do, and part of it is tradition. There's a wonderful little expression, and somebody has updated it in my 40 years at Rutgers every year in the washroom in the administration building. It says, Rutgers University, 247 years of tradition untouched by progress. And I think that is, it's a serious vein, that's part of a problem. There's a little mission creep, as Andrew mentioned. There are changes in players on both sides, and those things do become a challenge. So a lot of it has to do with the very first time that you write the proposal, everybody has to be realistic. Everybody wants to have the best response to the RFA, but the kinds of constraints that you have at a university or in a facilitating partner are a bit of a challenge. We are never equipped at universities, for instance, with the grant that we have together in Liberia, just to rent buildings and hire staff and buy vehicles in a country in another continent is remarkable. As the director of the experiment station, it's very hard for me to buy something in New Brunswick, New Jersey for the ag school to tell the purchasing people that the hole in the greenhouse needs to be fixed today and that I cannot put this out for bid and wait 7 or 8 weeks to have the problem resolved because the hole is getting bigger, and and there's research in the greenhouse. So there are great advantages to having partners, and you have to make sure you identify the strengths of each partner, the limitations of each partner, and really push each partner as much as you can, and not create great problems. At the same time, the partner, the institutions that you work with in the developing countries, and the other partner have to realize the kinds of constraints that we have. As a big AAU university, we have lots of rules about IRB, institutional review, and you just can't do surveys without having the appropriate reviews and the appropriate approvals. For my Thai project, to make it safe, every one of my Thai graduate students all passed the NIH online, thank God it's all online now, online certification that they understand human subjects. And it's interesting because it turned out to be a really good experience for them to appreciate the value of human subjects research and the limitations and the importance in having confidentiality and respecting folks, and more importantly, protecting people from any kind of adverse effect. So there's an upside. When you start to engage with folks in other countries, you realize that the institution, whoever is funding you, they have a fixed F&A rate. We all live by indirect rates. When you asked before about one of the incentives, of course, is indirect cost. And any university administrator that doesn't say that is not telling the truth. But many institutions don't have established F&A rates. It makes for a challenge. So I think that's the kind of thing, the fact that you can't always be nimble, the fact that you can't predict for changes, and as Andrew points out, there are changes in administration sometimes in their end, certainly at our end, and the biggest surprise, of course, is when it changes at the partner institution in the developing country. That makes for a big adventure. The last thing, because I get out of the left of my eye, Phil's about to tell me I'm done.
No, to the contrary, actually.
Oh, okay.
No, I just want to make sure you address some of the more learning content issues that we discussed, including problem-based and reality-based learning, and also industry partners.
Oh, good. Well, then I appreciate it. Okay, so then I'm getting a stay of execution. This is good. So one of the other challenges is the expectation on the other end. You know that in lots of institutions around the world, I don't care what country you pick, it doesn't have to be the US, it can be any country in the world, academic people still have sort of a Byzantine medieval approach to learning. And the chalk and talk approach is amazing. In our program in Liberia, it was amazing to me that they have this wonderful research farm, and the professors are all my vintage. I'm the oldest one up on the dais, so I can say this. And they all look like me, and they're up there talking and talking and talking and talking, and you can see these brilliant, beautiful young men and women who are very interested in learning, but they never get out of the room. Okay, because that's how they were taught. A lot of those folks were taught in the UK or in the United States, and so they came through that tradition. So whether you're in Asia or Africa or New Brunswick, New Jersey, that's one of the great challenges, that we don't challenge students to do problem-based learning. We finally required at our institution an experiential learning requirement. Kids have to go somewhere for an internship or a job. And the faculty just fought this tooth and nail. They thought it was the worst thing going. Employers really like it because the kid knows something when they show up for a job. And that's what's really important. In the eHealth project in Liberia, one of the most beneficial things we had was a conference where we brought people in who are going to employ these young men and women. And they gave very candid assessments. And one of them, which if you had not been a Liberian person, you would dare not say because it would offend other folks, but this gentleman was Liberian and said, the expectation for the young people that come through this program is that when they get back home to their village, they're going, and this is the quote, which at first made no sense, but then it did, is that they will be driven in by a chauffeur-driven new Toyota vehicle, and they will come in, making an enormous amount of money. When in fact, this young person, when he or she has a bachelor's degree, will start out, supervising. In this case, it was a palm oil operation. They'll be out in the field supervising the workers in the palm oil. They will not be a driven executive of the palm oil company and and all these things. I mean, you have to get the employer in there to help people have a reality check, to understand what kind of training they want in these young men and women. That's why the professional science masters actually has appeal both to our RTI partner and to the folks, in this case in the Philippines, because these young folks will come back with a technical discipline background, but also some business courses resources that they can apply when they go forward. So I think the fact that we have had, and it's a lot harder to do problem-based learning. It's a whole lot easier for me. And textbooks have become very lazy now. You assign a textbook, it even comes with the PowerPoints already for the faculty member. It's a cold day in hell when I use somebody else's PowerPoints. I always use my own. And I once had on a review, what did you get from this course? And the kid wrote, PowerPoint poisoning. But I think it's important I'm a toxicologist. We like to kill people. It's easy. You count dead people, you move ahead. But it's important it's a lot more work. And it's even more work in a developing country where you're already trying to change the pedagogy. And now you've really thrown a wrench in the gears because you've asked folks not only to change the way that you teach kids, but the way that the kids learn. And there's two different things, how you teach and how you learn. The interest we have in our 2+2 Chinese program, the students are so excited about coming, not that Rutgers is the greatest place to come, but they're so excited about coming because they said, in China, you don't go to class. You only buy the book and show up for the exam because there's no, the lectures are just in the book. You read the book. We make the kids show up and engage them, and I think that's what's important. I'm sure Rosemary does the same thing.
I'm going to take a little diversion before we go to Rosemary. There was a question from the audience about the question was for Mark and Andrew, that you mentioned developing new degrees through the STRIDE program. I assume you're referring to the professional science master's degrees, the PSM degrees. The question first, are these recognized in the US as well as the Philippines? And I'll answer that quickly. PSM was a program that the Sloan Foundation supported as an intermediate step between academic masters and PhDs to try to bring about a more science and business educated workforce. Michael Teitelbaum was the program officer who was really in charge of that, and Rutgers has had the fastest and highest uptake. So they are recognized in the US, but the question is, how are we looking to institutionalize new types of degrees in the target countries and in the existing university system? And this comes from a Rutgers alum. So, right there.
Where are you? Oh.
So how in implementation can we work to institutionalize new degrees in the host countries and host institutions?
Well, as because you asked the question, in advance, it's not easy. In fact, it's enormously challenging. Degrees are very, MS, MA, PhD are very well recognized. We were encouraging the Thai College of Public Health Science to think about a DRPH, a Doctorate in Public Health, which is a very well recognized degree in the US and in the UK and other places. And the answer was, no, we've never done that. And in a society that's 5,000 years old, they're not going to do it. So it's been very difficult. What we've had to do is basically what Phil just mentioned, which is where an entity has really sort of been the catalyst for it to happen and gotten buy-in in a lot of places to demonstrate that it's a professional degree. For someone that already has the training that they need and don't have the time or the resources to invest in a doctoral degree and don't necessarily need the research component, this has been the answer to maybe a question that wasn't asked, but a question that we came up with an answer and then hoped the question was asked. So it's very, very hard, and I was very pleased to see when we built that into the proposal that we did with RTI for STRIDE, that it was actually well received. Just for transparency, I have built that in 2 other proposals, and it didn't look like an MS or an MPH or anything like that, and actually the reviewers were very unkind towards that suggestion. So
You didn't mention that to us at the time.
no, I didn't. And now that we have the grant, I'll tell you some other stuff over a beer.
We probably wouldn't have listened anyway. But I'd like to make sure we have time for Rosemary to weigh in completely on this topic as well, as I think this is really the core, and then we'll move to sustainability after taking a couple more questions.
Sure. So I think with regard to implementation, I think one of the very important lessons that we've learned is to expect change and be flexible. Andrew mentioned, that sometimes there's confusion sometimes during the proposal writing process or that initial negotiation. And I have to say, I think that for us, I think that part was pretty smooth. I think what has happened since is that a lot of our initial proposal has changed. we expected to do something one way, and then we realized, well, we're probably not going to be able to do this, but let's, go down this path. A really good example initially is when we had just been funded for our planning grant, and, we were really focusing heavily on business administration curriculum and as a way to support young entrepreneurs. And our partners said, one of the ways that we can really support our students is to teach them English, because if they can speak English, their ability to be successful beginning small businesses is really multiplied. So that was something that we really shifted from the beginning, and we were able to implement that very successfully. Another project that we're looking at right now, another shift, as Hazel knows, we're always shifting, but we're exploring accreditation. Al-Kafat is accredited by their Ministry of Education, but we're looking at the U.S. accreditation process, and it's something that we've been able to sort of leverage the system, and different expertise in the system. So this is something that we think will improve, or at least, the process of self-study will lend itself to, improving the different programs at Al-Kafat. So this is something that we're looking into now, and this was never really on, part of our plan at the beginning. The other factor, I think, that has really sort of forced us to remain flexible is the region. Working in the Middle East, it's a very, very changing. It changes all the time, right? The situation. Working in Lebanon, not knowing, what the situation will be on the ground there, in the next couple of weeks. Is challenging, not just now, but it always has been. It's gotten more challenging, as you might imagine, but in any case, we always have to look for ways to stay flexible and to listen to our partners. I mean, it's really about what they say, and I think that, Hazel made a very good point before. You can't take a model and just kind of stick it into another place. You can't say, well, this works here, we can't say, well, this works here on Long Island in New York at Nassau Community College. So here you go. It's going to work in Lebanon, and that flexibility is really important. The other point, I think, is, just really respecting the differences in how institutions are managed, and at Nassau, there's we are always talking about shared governance, and to change anything in curriculum, you have to put together a proposal. I mean, I'm talking about a very minor piece of the curriculum. You have to put together a proposal. It has to go to the curriculum screening committee. It has to be approved there. Then it has to go to the full academic senate. There's usually a debate. They say, okay, we're going to talk about this in another meeting. And then if you're lucky, in a year, there's been movement on, what you want to do with your curriculum. And it's very, very different. It's a very top-down kind of management system that we're working with. And our faculty really struggled with that. They said, but how can we just, this isn't going to work if if the faculty isn't sort of actively involved in this. And what we've learned is the faculty absolutely is actively involved. I'm not saying that shared governance is wrong. It's a great thing. It's important. But there are other models that work, and I think that it's really been a lesson for us as well.
Great. Hazel, I do want to turn to you for just one of a key point that I think comes out in the Bimina example, and that is the engagement of industry through business advisory boards, vetting curriculum, conveying workforce development needs. I think that's something that comes up a lot. Can you talk a little bit about the range of implementation experiences around that?
Sure, yeah. That actually also relates to something that I was just thinking as Rosemary was talking about curricular reform, and that is, in so many of these contexts, one of the most important things for us to have in mind is to know the bureaucracy. right? To know how curricula are vetted, to know how they're approved, to know how the institution is functioning in the host country, if it's public, if it's private, you know, how things are moved up the food chain. And our partners, our US partners, are constantly learning that from our host country partners. And the reason why the business advisory boards are related to that is because we've seen that in some places, like in Jordan, in the case of this solar energy technology program, it's been very easy to engage the private sector because solar energy is a new and up and coming field in that context, and solar energy industry representatives want to be involved. There are really no other high quality training programs for solar energy. And so they want to have input, and the institution, Al Husn University College, needs that input from the industry because they haven't, their engineers, their faculty have not taught these things before. A different case of where an industry advisory board hasn't worked quite as well is in Morocco at one of the technical colleges where we're working in Rabat, where the industry advisory board just doesn't quite have its place in the administrative structure there. It's very challenging to try to engage the private sector because they don't think that the university system will listen to them. The university doesn't think that the private sector is going to necessarily work well with them. And so there's kind of this clash on both sides that our partnership director and his team at this college is trying to get around by thinking of a new way to approach this, a new paradigm of maybe having this advisory board as part of a larger pre-existing structure at the university. So if you want to hear more about that, I'm happy to talk more with you about that. But I think that the biggest sources of input that these types of boards are providing is curricular. It's also in providing one-on-one mentorship with students, connecting students with real practitioners, real people that are doing the job that they want to have eventually. It's also in opening the doors for internships and those kinds of real life experiences like Mark was discussing a little bit a few minutes ago. I think those are probably the three most common manifestations.
Great. I think there are a couple interesting points I just highlight. One is we often see in RFPs or RFAs that USAID is mentioning, for example, that it takes up to a year to get a curriculum change pushed through, and it's interesting to hear from American institutions that in fact, and here, it takes up to a year to get a curriculum change pushed through. So there's not a panacea on either side, and every governance model has its advantages and disadvantages, whether it's a Ministry of Education or a college senate that's slowing the process down and requiring it that it be managed effectively. So I think that's very interesting. And I think there's a lot of work to do in this track, this employer engagement question, as it goes from sort of the livelihoods-focused employment all the way up to higher education. Remains a real challenge, I think, with a diversity of solutions and answers. So, are there questions on the implementation side or comments that anyone would like to throw in before we turn to the sustainability question? Yes?
I'm Kirsten from IREX. I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about the research portion of the work, and I know like Stride is just getting started, so I'm not sure if how much you've addressed it, but sort of the work that you've done to find research needs that are agreeable to folks on both sides where there are interests. And then, you know, I think also in the States, we have a certain way that we think about research and faculty and their roles in the university and how much research they take on and how the role is structured within the university so that they can research, and that is different in other parts of the world. But we still, through these programs, are seeing academia as sort of a place where, you know, sort of the nexus of this research that's necessary for private industry to advance economic growth and all of that. So how you're thinking about addressing those issues.
Yeah. I'll take a first stab at some of this, and I'll probably talk about both programs, the one in Liberia and the one in the Philippines, because there are significant differences between the two, and I'll start with Liberia, where really the goal is not so much on what the research is, but how the research could be conducted. And we're starting at a place where there really is, for all intents and purposes, no research component at all. The agricultural school has not had an experimental farm for decades. In fact, the student body that graduated last year, the students after 4 years at an agricultural training program, had never once been out into a field. So that's, I mean, they hadn't planted a seed. So that was then the starting point, and the faculty, many of the faculty had gone through that program themselves. So kind of the approach that's being taken now is baby steps, kind of beginning to look at research methodologies, experimental farms, getting students engaged, faculty engaged. They're kind of almost learning simultaneously. And the research at this point is probably not groundbreaking research, but you know, it's what tomatoes are you know, actually able to grow in the climates there, and you know, those types of things. The Philippines is quite different in that there is a relatively healthy research community. One could argue about how effective it is, but one of the big challenges that we're facing there is that there is really no linkage between industry in the Philippines and the research going on at the universities. It's kind of, you know, probably overstating it, but research for the sake of research, and not really driven by any particular need, at least with any economic imperative or developmental imperative. And frankly, the industry has no confidence, or very little confidence, in the universities to be able to address their needs. So a lot of this is kind of, over the first couple of years, we're envisioning it's going to be building confidence and building those relationships between the industry and the universities, so that industry begins to look to universities more and more as a partner in this. And some of the program will be grants that are bringing those two sides together and carrying some of the risk through the project as those relationships begin to grow.
Yeah, I would really like to get to move on to sustainability, unless there's anything really, it doesn't look like anybody's jumping out of their seat right now with a burning question. So, all right, great. Hazel, I'll start with you. Quick thoughts on sustainability. We have about 5 minutes before we need to wrap up.
Sure, yeah. So I guess my first point about sustainability is that, you know, HED really emphasizes building sustainability into the design of the program. It sounds very, you know, self-apparent, but it's something that you wouldn't believe. So many projects just don't account for that until it's maybe 6 months before the end of the grant, and then what happens? So, you know, there are some tools that can be used in order to assess sustainability prospects during implementation as well, but really building that into the design is paramount. HED is actually working on a tool specific to higher education now. It's not quite ready yet, but if you are interested, come see me after, and I can get that info to you. The other thing that I wanted to say is that sustainability can most successfully be achieved in the examples that I've seen, that we've seen at HED, when there's really an institution-wide emphasis. When you're talking about an institution-to-institution partnership versus a department-to-department partnership. And this also helps us, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, deal with one major challenge, which is turnover of administration and turnover of faculty working on these projects. You know, for political, for economic, for, you know, personal reasons, your champion leaves. You thought you had this great champion, and now they're gone. So with a team approach, you're able to much more successfully continue implementing, continue building on your progress than as with a one-man, one-woman show type approach.
Great. Rosemary, you're in the thick of sustainability now, I think, on your first round. Thoughts on from the community college side?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Hazel. I think that you really do have to engage people at your institution, and you have to make sure you let them know exactly what you're doing. You have to really make sure that it's not just you. And if you're part of a system, as I am, you really, if you feel like engaging the system as a whole would help you, and it really has in my case. Part of what I do now is I work essentially for the State University of New York. So I'm at Nassau, but I've been seconded to the State University of New York to system administration as the program officer for Lebanon. So our system liked the program so much. They liked what we were doing, and SUNY was not involved in the Middle East. Well, we have dual degree programs in Turkey, but we were not involved in any kind of capacity building programming. So they really liked this, and we were able to sort of leverage their support. So we hope to continue, and one of our goals is to secure funding over time, as I'm sure it is for most people, but we really feel that we can do what we'll be able to do, but the program will continue because it's been brought into the system, and it is a system-to-system collaboration.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. Mark?
Everything that everyone mentioned, and for us as well, the notion of, as a four-year institution with graduate programs, to strategically place your graduates in the institution so that when I'm long gone, the notion of what we started will stay in place. Also, to when you have those key people, to I email Thailand every other day, and once a week we have a Skype call. You take advantage of that kind of meeting, and then physically go there. It's never good when the university vice president asks your secretary, I don't suppose Dr. Robson would be around, and you go, no, he's away. But the idea is to physically go there too. You can't run an operation in another country when you're not there. And so in addition to having people that you trust and that really are engaged on the ground, if you're the leader, you're the PI, you're the major partner, you have to be there too. And that requires resources, and it also requires very strategic management of your time.
And to implementers, that means budget enough time to get your university PI or project leader out there enough. I think would be the translation.
And
Finally, Andrew?
I'd just add, multi-level relationship building throughout the institutions, from students on up through the head of the administration. And I think two of the things that can really be enduring in these relationships are the research opportunities between the universities that can be ongoing, and the student engagement and opportunities for exchange.
Great. Great. One of the things we learned in formulating the Philippines project was that actually turnover is a double-edged sword, because sometimes it propagates people with relationships with U.S. universities into more local institutions, and sometimes it takes the rug out from under. So both individual and institutional level relationship building seems to be the way to go. We have no time, but we'll still take a question or two if there are any final thoughts, or if everybody really needs some coffee. All right, well, thanks for joining us today. Let's give our presenters a hand.